Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on critical thinking and writing, which I put together for the School of Graduate Studies here at Memorial for their EDGE program. So I want to begin with the land acknowledgements and to acknowledge that I'm a settler on the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated, and that these are the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. And I want to acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor in the adult post-secondary education. I teach a graduate research writing course, which is delivered in the fall and is open to students across the university. I've written a number of books on graduate research writing and thesis writing, and of course, lots of publications. And I have now about 30 years of experience in this. So, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I read up about. This is what I'm immersed in, is teaching academic, graduate writing, and doctoral writing. I also have a YouTube channel, and what I'm going to go through today, I have several videos on my channel that you can go and have a look at, but lots of other very practical strategies that you can use on various aspects of thesis writing. So please go and have a look at that, have a look at the playlists. So my purpose here in this presentation is to talk about what it means to be critical and how you can translate critical thinking into writing. So, what does this mean? And I think it's especially important now with AI, where it's so easy to, put a topic in a tool, an AI tool, and then get an output. What are we doing when we do that? And then just to give you practical strategies on how to think critically and how to take that into your writing. So, why do we need critical thinking? I always thought that critical thinking was important. I really believe that that's our role as universities is to encourage critical thinking. If we don't think critically, who will? Critical thinking is not something that's natural. In fact, what is natural is conformity. It's easier to conform. It's much more difficult to think critically. And why do we need to think critically now? Well, with social media that is targeted, we often only see our own worldview being reflected back to us. There's so much misinformation, so much fake news. How do we make sense of this? Who do we believe? If you are using AI, you must know by now that the large language models are full of hallucinations. So basic inaccuracies. I mean, I think to call it a hallucination is a euphemism, but basic inaccuracies, which the outputs sound very convincing, but they are wrong. But AI is also full of biases. So if you're going to use AI, you need to think about critically engaging with this. And then, of course, is the big issue of if AI is thinking for us, what does that mean? Again, there's a euphemism which says we cognitively offload to AI. So what does it mean if we cognitively offloading? And what are the consequences for us? So, what is critical thinking? At its most basic level, what we're looking at is understanding and analyzing available, information, arguments, evidence, so that we can make an informed assessment or to draw sound conclusions. And then we can make sound decisions based on that. And it's really difficult to separate reading and writing. I often forget about the reading part of it because I'm so focused on writing. But really, critical reading is absolutely crucial. And I'm talking about critical reading in terms of social media, in terms of AI, whatever you're reading, it's absolutely crucial that you are reading with that critical eye. And I just want to explain the different levels. So are when we are faced with a text, the most basic level is just understanding what has been written. And this is at the surface level. So, not questioning anything, just taking what has been produced as at its face value. So, if you put a prompt into ChatGPT, your assignment prompt, let's say, and you get an essay being produced by that, and you submit that essay, that is the most basic functional level of reading. Higher order thinking is where you're beginning to make meaning from a text. And this is where you bring your own knowledge, your own, sociocultural perspective, and you begin to look at that text in terms of, do I agree with this? So, in the context of generative AI, what you might do is look at your produced essay and say, I don't agree with that. I would not say this. That language is not mine, so I wouldn't include this. And in my context, that doesn't really, make sense. So that's not quite right. So we're engaging with the text, possibly shaping the meaning. Now, critical literacy is where we read against the text. And this is where we really are looking at why was this text produced? So we're trying to unpack assumptions, values, and positions. And critical literacy emerged, of course, out of political propaganda, but also around advertising to see, to help people to see what advertisers were trying to do and how they were trying to shape your buying interests. So, whose interests are being served here? Are they really your interests? How could this text be read otherwise? Are there, resistant readings to this? Do you have to accept what is being produced? So, in the context of generative AI, this might be saying, according to my values, I don't want to participate in something that is environmentally harmful. Let's say, for example, um, I don't want to participate in surveillance capital where my data is being collected and used to service these large language models, things like that. So you're reading against the text. So just to, reinforce this, here's a meme that I use often in my classes, and the surface decoding is just understanding what the text says. What if I told you everything you learned about writing in high school was a lie? So that's the surface text. If you start to make meaning about it, you would say, well, there's some revelation going on here. What if I told you is not something, that's something that indicates a secret. So there's some message that's being conveyed. You might say, well, this meme comes from a movie, The Matrix, where there was a big secret in The Matrix and it all was revealed and it was shocking. So you would be making meaning like that. Now, if you're reading against the text, you might say, well, this comes out of a particular cultural context. Um, there's perhaps there's aggression in here. And actually, if you look in the glasses of this character, you will see someone holding a gun. So to someone else's head. So there is a subliminal message in there that is very aggressive. So, reading against the text, you might say, no, I don't want to use this. I don't want to have this in my course, for example. Um, so, those are the layers that, I mean, any text has really. Okay, so how do we translate that critical reading into critical writing? And what I always use in my classes is Bloom's taxonomy. Those of you who aren't in education may not know Bloom's taxonomy. And actually, I'm using Bloom's taxonomy, even though there are lots of critiques about it, because in terms of writing, Bloom's taxonomy provides us with a vocabulary to see what we're doing in writing. So it's a very helpful way to see what we are doing when we write. Now, for the purists of those of you who are purists around Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom and his team originally developed a taxonomy in the 1950s, and this was reworked in 2001. In terms of writing, I prefer the original taxonomy, and I'll show you exactly why as we go on. But they do correspond, and I'll talk about both. Okay, so the one thing that's really important to understand about Bloom's taxonomy, and this applies so much to writing, is that what Bloom said, and his team, because he had a big team, was that you can't understand something if you don't have knowledge first. And you can't apply something if you don't have knowledge and understand it. And you can't analyze something unless you have these three lower order thinking skills in place. The higher order thinking skills are analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. But again, for example, you can't understand the evaluation unless you've explained the provided information, made some sense of it, used it in some way, either, through examples, analyzed it, broken it apart, synthesized it, pulled it back together again, and then made some kind of judgment. Only then are you moving up to the higher order thinking skills. And this applies totally in writing. Okay, so let's have a look at it in much more detail. So when you are dealing with the remembering stage, and this is the information stage, knowledge, information, this is where you are providing the writer with information. So either, you're recalling something and then putting it in, or you are gathering information, describing, summarizing, defining. When it comes to making sense or understanding, you take that information and you make sense of it. And perhaps you add to your summary, you interpret it in some way, you explain something. Um, in order to really show that you've understood something, you need to apply it. And this is often done by using diagrams, tables, using the knowledge in some way. So if you are translating the information into a process or a sequence, then you're applying. And, in writing, if you use examples, so in making sense and trying to help the reader understand, if you show examples of where this concept has been used, that's a form of applying. Analyzing is breaking up that concept or breaking up elements within, a paper or a category or something like that. And you compare and contrast. You might look at, are there causal relationships between these? So you're looking at the relationships, the connections. You might create categories. So, what Bloom's and the team did with these thinking skills was to analyze thinking skills into these different categories. Synthesis is the stage after analysis where you draw conclusions with insight. So, because of the analytical procedure, you can now say something more. And synthesis is about bringing things back together, concluding, composing something, a new whole, right? And but the synthesis is always more than the analysis in the sense that you are pulling together something based on the analysis. Evaluation is where we look back at the process of analysis and synthesis and critique it. We could defend because critique doesn't necessarily have to be negative. We could defend our arguments, but really what you are doing is taking that critical eye and say, was this a worthwhile process? And then create, which, the later version of Bloom's taxonomy said is the highest thinking skill, is where you produce something on your own and you construct new knowledge out of everything that you've done before. So just a quick point about using ChatGPT or a large language model. Where do you think on the thinking skills taxonomy that activity would be? Well, it would be right at the bottom because you aren't even finding the information. So you are not engaging with any thinking skills whatsoever if you put a prompt into ChatGPT and you accept it unthinkingly. Now, if you decide to use two AI tools and then compare the two outputs, perhaps do some research, find, some additional information so that you can judge the outputs, then you are moving up into the higher order thinking skills. But if you are just using an AI tool to produce something, then you are not engaging your thinking skills at all. Okay, so let's look how this works in writing. So when you provide knowledge for your reader or information, this is what you would normally do with descriptions and summaries. So you're not making sense of it, but you're just providing the initial information. So, for example, if you were looking at a concept, perhaps let's say the concept of poverty, poverty as a concept, you might describe when it first emerged, when did the concept of poverty emerge after the Second World War? What does the concept of poverty relate to? Maybe so and so in the literature has described it like this, whereas somebody else in the literature has described it like that. When you move into understanding and comprehension, now you begin interpreting and you're explaining meaning. And here's where you could say, you could begin to explain what went on before the concept of poverty emerged. So if the concept of being poor is the same as the concept of poverty, so you are beginning to interpret and you're beginning to explain and make sense. You might then move into application, and this is where you might say, well, the concept of poverty was applied in Europe in this way, in Africa in this way. But these are the different ways of thinking about poverty in these concepts. So different examples. Now, when we come to analysis, um, we're moving into the higher order thinking skills. So now you are beginning to break things apart. So what you might do here is look at the ways in which people have conceptualized poverty over time. So author A says it's this, author B says it's that, author C says it's this. What are the commonalities between those three perspectives? What are the differences? Are there any particular patterns? Is there a time element where things have changed over time? Is there a geographic element where things are not the same as they've been applied in different countries? So this is now breaking things apart and beginning to look at the components. And you might come up at the end of your analysis with conclusions. And the conclusions are the close analysis conclusions. So these are the conclusions that you get from your analytical procedure. From this, we move in. Oh, I forgot about this one. So this is an example of analysis, dogs versus cats as pets. So breaking up pets into dogs and cats, and you might have categories, and then, compare them. Obviously, you want to have some evidence that you can use to back up your claims. And I'm going to come back to this because I'm sure you can see all sorts of problems with that. But you could get more complicated, and people often use tables when they are working with analysis. So if you are developing your literature review, for example, you might want to work things out in a table rather than in your head, so that you can have a systematic analytical procedure to unpack different concepts and aspects of concepts. Okay, so now moving into synthesis. So once you finish the analysis, now you begin to pull things together. And with synthesis, we do this usually by saying, okay, what have we done in the analysis and what sense can we make of it? So we're drawing bigger conclusions. You might have developed close conclusions after the analysis. Synthesis means taking a step back and broadening out again. And this often involves looking at the literature again, saying, how does my analysis compare to the literature? So if you were doing an analysis of two articles, you might look at a third article to see, how does that compare to your analysis of these two? But the issue synthesized will always be bigger, deeper, or a different shape because of the insight gained from the analysis. And you are also abstracting with the synthesis. You're drawing these bigger conclusions. So in synthesis, we're combining, integrating, designing, pulling things together into some kind of diagrammatic form. We might be generalizing depending on the data, hypothesizing, or constructing. So you can see in writing that you would have a separate section for analysis and then a paragraph or two on synthesis where you're pulling things together. So if I had to ask you, what could you synthesize from this analysis? Well, you could synthesize that dogs make better pets because they're friendly and they dress up and because they don't have a superior attitude. So that would be synthesis, right? Pulling together points from making insights from that analysis. And again, you can complicate it. You can use tables like this. So within your analysis, you could have synthesis categories where you're looking across your concepts. What can I say now? Or you're looking within a concept. What can I synthesize about this concept after my analysis? Then evaluation is the critical eye, and this is where we judge the analytical and the synthesis processes. And we really are assessing what we've done. We could be defending it because we might think our process was solid, or we could be critiquing it. So, I mean, the reason why I used this was so that we could get to this point. If we were evaluating this analysis and synthesis, I might say, well, the categories of dogs and cats is too broad. That within the categories of dogs, there are as many, different kinds of dogs, and some dogs might have superior attitudes, and some might be very unfriendly. So the category is too big. In the category of cats, the same thing applies. When we look at the middle categories, are those comparing apples and oranges or, so you need to question. I mean, obviously, when you're doing the analysis, hopefully you would question all of this right at the beginning. But my evaluation would be that, this is just a general broad brushstroke based on very little information. But that's what you're doing with evaluation is you saying, have I really interrogated this in a way that can yield results that readers will believe? So when it comes to evaluation, I just wanted to bring this in here. I also teach this a lot in my classes because it helps you with critical thinking if you can think about this. We always come to reading and writing and any academic work with two main types of assumptions. Implicit assumptions, and those are the ones we're not aware of, and explicit assumptions, and these are the ones we are aware of. Now, one would hope that through a university education, you would begin to learn more and more about the implicit assumptions that you make because you are constantly questioning, you are always looking at objections to your argument, and you are trying to surface those assumptions that might be affecting the way you're thinking. Um, and critical thinking and higher order thinking generally. So the analysis, synthesis, and evaluation are really all about uncovering and checking assumptions and exploring alternative perspectives. So if you look in this, you can see an assumption, a biased assumption in here. That is my biased assumption, and that is in favor of dogs. And you can see that because of the categories that I've chosen, um, where I'm implicitly thinking, well, dogs are obviously, going to make the better pet. Um, so those assumptions slip into our ways of thinking, and it's part of the kind of scholarly project to continually be checking for those assumptions. And once you start thinking about assumptions, then you can begin to question them in the articles or papers or texts that you're reading, in other research. So it helps you to identify elements of critical thinking. So there are many assumptions, many. But Stephen Brookfield, who is an adult educator and who's someone who works a lot in critical thinking, and whose work I admire a lot, uses these three. And I agree with him that these three common implicit assumptions are what we see really often in academic writing, and especially research. Um, so the first one is paradigmatic assumptions, and these are our worldviews. They are our beliefs about what the world is like. And often we think everybody sees the world in the same way, but actually we don't. So a belief of the world could be that only a few people are able to get rich while the majority remain poor. I mean, there might be, multiple other worldviews, but let's just use that as the example. So paradigmatic assumptions, really one of the most common assumptions is a worldview. So this is what the world is like. Prescriptive assumptions are what the world should be like. And again, very common. People always have opinions about what the world should be like. So, for example, the rich should share their wealth and help the poor because they have had more opportunities or whatever. Um, that's a prescriptive assumption. So, anytime you begin to use the word should, then you know you are in a prescriptive assumption. And then another very common assumption in research, particularly, when I'm working with research students and we're conceptualizing their research, is this causal assumption. Because as humans, we always want to look for a reason for something. So this cause and effect, well, this is a result of that. And thinking cause and effect often closes off a whole range of things that it could be because we're trying to latch onto one. So, causal or predictive assumptions, this is why we think things happen. So, if the rich shared their wealth, then society would be more equitable. And would it? That's the question, right? Would, do we need to think about equitable societies in terms of value rather than money? So if you look for the one cause, you close off the complexity of the issue. But it's a very, it's almost like it's a human conditioning that we look for the one result. So looking for causal kind of relationships is something that can really help with your reading as well. Okay. So that's just a layer of critical thinking that you can bring when you get to those higher order thinking skills. So using Bloom's taxonomy, obviously, I'm not saying you must use it in a very prescriptive way, but really what I'm saying is that it can help you to see the difference between a description passage, like a paragraph that is descriptive, and a paragraph that is analytical. Because you can say to yourself, have I made meaning in this paragraph? No. Okay, it's descriptive. Have I compared, contrasted, broken up the concept in this paragraph? Yes. Okay, it's analytical. After my analysis, did I bring things together again? Have I made sense of the analysis for my reader? Yes. Okay, it's synthesis. So each of the thinking skills um, help you to analyze the paragraphs that you've written. And you can go through all of the thinking skills in one paragraph, or you could have different paragraphs in a section that you pull together as an overall section. So it can help you structure your writing, it can help you think through what you're doing, and it helps you to see your own writing rather than relying on somebody else to tell you what you're doing. So I use this a lot as well, and I have a video on this, and that is thinking about the formula of a paragraph. So you can use these thinking skills in a paragraph if you wanted to. So I'm talking about, a half-page paragraph here, and these would just be a few sentences. So the first thing is to make a point, which would be the focus of the paragraph. So this is some kind of claim that you're making. Then you would explain further. So you would either provide more information, more description, which is the knowledge stage of things. Then you might make sense of it and add examples. So now you're moving into comprehension and application. And by examples, I mean use the research literature, show a study that did X, Y, or Z, that takes your information a bit further. So you're saying this is what I'm saying about concept X. This is how Jones 2025 has used concept X. So you're moving from information to comprehension and application. You might compare and contrast two ways of using concept X, which would be the analysis, and you can do that very briefly. You could say, author X argues that concept X does this and that. However, Y suggests, or in contrast, author Y suggests something completely different. So one sentence, you can have an analytical sentence. Synthesis is author X is more convincing because whatever you've got that you've built into the paragraph so far would help you pull out that sentence. And then an evaluation sentence, which says perhaps we need to extend the analysis to include concept A. So the evaluation just gives you that very scholarly approach to what you've written. So in one paragraph, you can go through all the thinking skills. Just to expand on the higher order thinking skills, really what you're doing with critical thinking is that you're asking questions. You're not just taking things at face value, you're asking questions. I mean, one of the questions I always ask when I'm reading something is when was this written? Because papers are always written in a context. So when was this written? Where was it written? But you might have a lot more questions under these categories. These are just a few to help you get started. In what ways have researchers addressed this concept, topic, issue? What conclusions have researchers drawn? What do we know or not know about this? What are the assumptions being made? So you could ask the paradigmatic assumptions here. Synthesis questions, what agreements or disagreements are there in the research? What continuities over time, what commonalities, what issues are contentious. Evaluation questions are, that little bit deeper. So what concepts have not been considered? What silences are there? What issues were there with the analysis procedure? And what assumptions, are in this whole process? But also, what assumptions do I have? And just to show you how this fits within the format of a research paper. And here I'm looking at a traditional peer-reviewed IMRAD paper, a traditional research paper where the author has gone out and collected primary data. Um, you know, these thinking skills also fit in other types of papers, but I'm just using this as an example. So in the introduction of a research paper, you would discuss the conceptualization of this particular research project and provide information. So you're telling the reader what this is about. That's the information. In the literature review section, now literature reviews are a little bit more complicated because they really go through the whole spectrum of the thinking skills. So you would be providing information, making sense of it, using examples from the literature, but doing this in an analytical way. So if you're exploring concepts, you would be using analysis and you would need to come to conclusions at the end of your literature review, which is synthesis. So literature reviews, as I'm sure you all know, are complicated pieces of writing because they do that. They go through all the thinking skills. The method is most often providing the reader with information about how the data was collected, but also with an understanding of how this project has been set up. So you're making sense of it as well. The results or the findings section, this is where you present the results of the data analysis. So whatever data you collected, however you analyzed it, this is where you would present it. And at the end of the results section, you might come up with close findings, which are related directly to the data. The discussion section is about taking those close findings related to the analysis and then comparing them with what you found in the literature review. So this is the step back with synthesis. You're saying, I've done this analysis, I came up with these results. How does this compare to what I've read in the literature? And then you come up with conclusions. So everything you found might be the same. That's a synthesis conclusion. Some elements might be different. That's a synthesis conclusion. And then the final kind of paragraph is usually an evaluation. And this is where people will say, well, in the future, research on X, Y, and Z would make these results stronger, or a limitation of the study is X, Y, and Z. But ultimately, you want to showcase the richness of your data or the strength of your analytical procedure, but in a scholarly way, say, one of the limitations or whatever was this. So that's the evaluation. So you can see how the thinking skills work in a traditional research paper. The last thing that I want to say is that people often don't engage in critical thinking because it requires intellectual labor. And what I want to urge you is not to be afraid of hard thinking. Just because something is challenging doesn't mean that we don't need to do it. And at universities, I think this is our job. Our job is to think critically. And I think in the world of AI, we need critical thinking now more than ever. I should say AI and social media. Sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes you think, well, I can't see anything in this to say. But what I would urge you to do is to persevere and to take it on as a task. I'm not going to give up just because it's difficult. I'm not going to give up just because I can't do it quickly. I'm going to engage in intellectual labor because I'm a scholar. This means engaging in reading as well as in your own writing, even if it's challenging. And then, of course, to question your own assumptions. All right, that's it from me. Thank you very much, everyone. Don't forget to go and have a look at the videos that I have in on my YouTube channel. I have quite a few on moving from description to analysis and synthesis. Yep, that's it from me. I hope you have a fabulous day. Bye.